It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Hand over the prototype drive, Oliver, Austin Brennan demanded, his voice echoing through the glass-walled boardroom of Brennan Tech. Oliver West didn't move. He sat at the far end of the mahogany table, his hands folded neatly over a manila folder. Across from him, the board of directors sat in heavy leather chairs, their faces obscured by the blue light of the projector. At the head of the table sat Charles Brennan, the CEO and the man Oliver had spent 5 years helping to build this empire. Charles wouldn't look at him. He was too busy adjusting his silk tie, his eyes fixed on the city skyline beyond the window. "Did you hear me?" Austin snapped, stepping into Oliver's personal space. The scent of expensive, cloying sandalwood cologne rolled off him in waves. He leaned down, his palms flat on the table, showcasing the $20,000 Patek Philippe strapped to his wrist. "The Titan engine is a Brennan Tech asset. That means it's my asset. Hand it over." "I spent 3 years in the lab developing that architecture, Austin," Oliver said, his voice a low, steady contrast to the younger man's frantic energy. "You haven't stepped foot in the R&D wing since the Christmas party. You don't even know the operating temperature of the primary turbine." Austin laughed, a sharp, jagged sound that made Lucas Rivera, a junior engineer sitting behind Oliver, flinch. "I don't need to know the temperature. I have the name on the building. You're just the help, Oliver. Highly paid help, sure, but let's not confuse labor with legacy." He reached out and snatched the silver flash drive sitting near Oliver's elbow. Oliver didn't stop him. He watched with a detached, clinical interest as Austin held the drive up like a trophy, showing it to the silent board members. "With this," Austin announced, turning toward his father, "we secure the garrison contract tomorrow. I've already prepared the presentation. I'll be the one walking William Garrison through the specs. Oliver, you're dismissed. In fact, consider your vacation starting. Permanently." A heavy silence fell over the room. Marcus, the company's lead legal counsel, shifted in his seat, his pen hovering over a notepad. He glanced at Oliver, a flicker of something petty perhaps crossing his face before he returned to his professional mask. "Charles?" Oliver asked softly. The CEO finally turned. There was no warmth in his gaze, only the cold calculation of a man protecting his cub. "Austin is right, Oliver. This is a family business. We appreciate the work you've done, but the Titan project needs a face that matches the brand. We've prepared a generous severance package. Marcus has the papers." "I see," Oliver said. He stood up slowly, the movement fluid and controlled. Austin smirked, stepping back to let the defeated man pass. "Don't feel too bad. Maybe you can find a job at a firm that appreciates state school grit. Just make sure you leave your keycard at the desk. We wouldn't want any disgruntled ex-employees wandering the halls." Oliver ignored the jab. He turned to Lucas, who was looking at the floor, his knuckles white. "Lucas, keep your head down. Do your work." "Yes, sir," the junior engineer whispered. Austin rolled his eyes. "Enough with the melodrama." "Get out, Oliver. You're polluting the air." Oliver walked toward the door, but he paused at the threshold. He looked back at Austin, who was already trying to plug the drive into the boardroom's main console. The arrogance in the younger Brennan's posture was almost physical, a shield of entitlement that blinded him to everything else. "Austin!" Oliver called out. The bully looked up, annoyed. "What now? Want a recommendation letter? Forget it. I just wanted to remind you to check the garrison protocol in the subdirectories," Oliver said, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching the corners of his mouth. "It's the foundation of the entire engine's stability. Without it, the whole system is just expensive scrap metal." Austin waved him off dismissively. "I've got it handled. I'm a Brennan. We don't need advice from the help." Oliver nodded and stepped out into the hallway. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind him, muffling the sound of Austin's boastful voice. The office was quiet, the late afternoon sun casting long, golden shadows across the marble floor. Oliver walked to his desk, but he didn't pack a box. He didn't need to. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, black encrypted drive, the real Titan engine core. The silver one Austin was currently fumbling with contained nothing but a sophisticated looping simulation that would look perfect on a screen, but fail the moment a real stress test was applied. He felt the cold weight of the drive in his palm. For 5 years, he had been the silent engine behind the Brennan name, the sleeping lion they thought they could tame with a paycheck and a title. They had mistaken his silence for weakness and his loyalty for subservience. As he reached the elevator, his phone buzzed. It was a message from an unsaved number. "Is it done?" Oliver typed back a single word. "Yes." The elevator doors opened, the chime sounding like a funeral bell for the company he was leaving behind. He stepped inside and watched his reflection in the polished steel. He looked the same, modest suit, tired eyes, a man who looked like he'd just lost everything. But as the doors closed, Oliver West felt a surge of adrenaline he hadn't experienced in years. Austin Brennan thought he had just won the crown. He had no idea he had just been handed a ticking time bomb, and Oliver was the only one with the code to stop it. The real game hadn't even started yet. He had 48 hours until the garrison meeting, 48 hours to ensure that when the Brennan legacy collapsed, it did so in front of the entire world. He walked out of the lobby, the cool evening air hitting his face, and didn't look back at the building once. He had work to do. The next morning, the air in the small corner cafe smelled of burnt espresso and damp pavement. Oliver West sat by the window, his fingers tracing the cold condensation on a bottle of mineral water. He hadn't slept, but the exhaustion felt like armor, heavy, grounding, and necessary. Across from him, Lucas Rivera looked like he had spent the night vibrating with anxiety. His junior engineer's tie was crooked, and he kept glancing at the door as if the Brennan security team might burst in at any moment. "He did it, Oliver," Lucas whispered, his voice shaking. He slid a tablet across the scarred wooden table. "Austin sent a company-wide blast at 6 a.m. He's not just taking credit for the garrison project. He's claiming you were terminated for gross negligence and technical incompetence. He said he had to personally step in to fix the catastrophic errors you left behind." Oliver didn't flinch. He scrolled through the memo, watching the digital ink smear under his thumb. It was a masterpiece of arrogance. Austin Brennan hadn't just stolen the crown. He was trying to salt the earth where Oliver stood. The memo was filled with status-driven vitriol, painting Oliver as a disgruntled mid-level employee who had tried to sabotage the company's future out of jealousy for Austin's visionary leadership. "The board is eating it up," Lucas continued, his eyes wide. Even Charles Brennan signed off on the statement. "They're calling Austin the savior of the legacy." They've already scheduled the Garrison Gala for tomorrow night to announce the partnership. William Garrison is flying in personally. Oliver felt a familiar, cold spark in his chest. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, silver-encrypted drive. He set it on the table with a soft asterisk clack that seemed to silence the surrounding chatter of the cafe. "Austin thinks he bought a finished product," Oliver said, his voice calm and level. "He thinks he inherited a kingdom. What he doesn't realize is that I didn't just build the garrison system. I am the system. Every line of code, every architectural bypass, and every security handshake is tied to a proprietary license held by a shell company he's never heard of. A company I've owned since before I ever stepped foot in Brennan headquarters." Lucas leaned in, his breath hitching. "You mean the core isn't theirs?" "The hardware belongs to the Brennans," Oliver replied, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "But the soul of the machine belongs to me. Without my authorization key, the entire project is nothing more than expensive scrap metal. And the clock is ticking. The system requires a manual validation every 48 hours. If it doesn't get it, the Garrison project doesn't just stop. It resets to factory defaults." The vibration of Oliver's phone on the table interrupted the moment. The caller ID displayed a name that made Lucas's face go pale again. Austin Brennan. Oliver answered, putting it on speaker. "I hope you're enjoying the view from the gutter, Oliver," Austin's voice boomed, dripping with the casual cruelty of a man who had never faced a consequence in his life. "I saw the LinkedIn update. Open to work. Bold move for a man with a reputation in tatters. I made sure the recruiters know exactly why you were escorted out. You're radioactive. You couldn't get a job cleaning the floors at a startup now. I appreciate the update, Austin, Oliver said, his tone entirely neutral. Don't use that tone with me, Austin snapped, his entitlement flaring through the speaker. You're a footnote, a mistake I've corrected. Tomorrow night, when I'm standing next to William Garrison and signing the biggest deal in the city's history, you'll be sitting in your pathetic little apartment wondering where it all went wrong. Just remember, people like you are tools. When the tool breaks, we throw it away and buy a better one. I'm the architect now. I'm the one the world is going to remember. You're right about one thing, Austin, Oliver said, looking at the silver drive. Tomorrow night will be a moment the world remembers. I'll see you at the gala. You aren't invited, you loser, Austin laughed, the sound harsh and jagged. Security has your photo at every entrance. Try to get in and you'll spend the night in a cell. Stay in your lane, West, it's over. The line went dead. Oliver looked up at Lucas, who was staring at him with a mixture of terror and awe. He's right about the security, Lucas said. How are we going to get in? Oliver stood up, tossing a few bills onto the table. He tucked the silver drive back into his pocket, his eyes turning to flint. Austin forgot one very important detail, Oliver said. He spent so much time trying to erase my name from the company that he forgot to check the guest list for the Garrison estate. William Garrison doesn't like Nepo babies, Lucas. He likes results. And 24 hours from now, the only person in that room who can make the Garrison project work will be the man Austin just tried to destroy. He checked his watch. The countdown had begun. Contact the legal counsel, Marcus, Oliver commanded, his voice gaining a sharp, predatory edge. Tell him the sleeping lion is awake, and tell him to have the ownership injunctions ready for tomorrow night. We aren't just going to a gala. We're going to a funeral for a legacy. 2 days later, the rain-slicked windows of the legal district blurred the city into a smear of gray and neon. Inside the hushed, mahogany-lined sanctuary of the firm's private wing, the air smelled of old parchment and expensive espresso. Oliver West sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the glowing monitor where a progress bar flickered at 99%. Marcus stood by the window, his tailored charcoal suit reflecting the dim light. The legal counsel didn't speak. He simply watched the screen with the practiced patience of a man who had seen empires rise and fall on the strength of a single document. With a soft chime, the bar turned green. The mirror vault is active, Marcus said, his voice a low, rhythmic baritone. He turned, holding out a leather-bound folder embossed with a silver seal. The original source code, the time-stamped architecture, and the hidden ghost signatures you embedded in the Garrison project's core. It's all here, decrypted and verified. Austin Brennan didn't just steal your work, Oliver. He tried to claim a legacy he couldn't even read. Oliver reached out, his fingers brushing the cool, heavy paper of the ownership injunction. It was more than just a legal filing. It was a death warrant for a lie. He felt the weight of it, a physical anchor for the storm he was about to unleash. He hadn't slept more than 4 hours since leaving the Brennan headquarters, but the exhaustion was a distant hum, drowned out by the cold, sharp clarity of the hunt. "And the board?" Oliver asked. "They're still in the dark," Marcus replied, a thin smile touching his lips. "Charles Brennan has spent the last 48 hours fast-tracking the Garrison contract. He's so desperate to legitimize his son's genius that he's bypassed 3 separate compliance checks. He's handing us the rope, and Austin is already tying the noose." The scene shifted an hour later to the lobby of the Brennan West Tower, soon to be just the Brennan Tower, if the gold leaf signs being installed were any indication. Oliver stepped through the glass doors, the scent of industrial floor wax and lilies hitting him. He saw them immediately near the elevators, a cluster of junior engineers huddled around Austin Brennan. Austin was draped in a navy silk blazer that cost more than a junior engineer's annual rent. He was holding a glass of amber liquid, despite it being barely noon, and his laugh echoed off the marble walls with a jarring, entitled frequency. "I'm telling you," Austin said, his voice carrying to the security desk. "The garrison deal is just the start. Once we purge the dead weight, the guys who think integrity is more important than innovation, this company is going to double its valuation." He spotted Lucas Rivera standing near the directory, clutching a stack of blueprints. Austin's smirk widened. He sauntered over, the ice clinking in his glass like a taunt. "Still carrying papers, Rivera?" Austin sneered, loud enough for the entire lobby to hear. He reached out and flicked the edge of the blueprints, causing several sheets to flutter to the floor. "I thought you followed your little hero out the door. Or did you realize that West's integrity doesn't pay the mortgage? Maybe if you beg, I'll let you fetch my lunch tomorrow." Lucas went stiff, his face flushing a deep, humiliated red as he knelt to gather the scattered papers. Two of the other engineers chuckled nervously, looking away to avoid the fallout. The injustice of it was a physical heat in the room, a familiar, suffocating arrogance that Austin wore like a crown. Oliver stepped forward, his footsteps silent on the polished stone. He stopped 3 feet behind the younger Brennan. "He's staying because he's a professional, Austin, a concept you've always struggled to grasp." Austin spun around, his eyes narrowing as he took in Oliver's modest, dark gray suit. He didn't look at Oliver's face. He looked at his shoes, his lip curling in a dismissive sneer. "West, I'm surprised security let you pass the curb. Come to pick up your final box of pens? Or are you here to ask for a reference? I might give you one if you can explain why you're wearing a suit that looks like it came from a clearance rack." "I'm here to deliver a courtesy," Oliver said, his voice level and devoid of heat. He didn't flinch, didn't raise his tone. He simply watched Austin with the detached interest of an engineer examining a faulty gear. "The Garrison Gala is tomorrow night. I wanted to make sure you were prepared." Austin let out a sharp, barking laugh, turning to his circle of sycophants for validation. "Prepared? I'm the guest of honor. William Garrison is personally introducing me as the lead architect. While you're sitting in some dive bar wondering where it all went wrong, I'll be signing the largest contract in the city's history." He leaned in closer, the smell of expensive scotch and unearned confidence radiating from him. "You're a ghost, Oliver. A footnote. In 24 hours, nobody will even remember how to spell your name." Oliver didn't blink. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, silver invitation, the one Lucas had secured. He held it between 2 fingers, the light catching the embossed Garrison crest. "You're right about one thing, Austin," Oliver said softly. "Tomorrow night will be historic. You look like you're heading to a triumph." He paused, his gaze turning to Flint. "I'd suggest you treat it like a funeral. It's more appropriate for the occasion." Austin's smirk flickered for a fraction of a second, a shadow of confusion crossing his features before his ego reasserted itself. "Get out of my lobby, West. You're depressing the staff." Oliver turned without another word, nodding to Lucas, who stood a little straighter now. As he walked toward the exit, he felt the weight of the silver drive in his pocket. The countdown was no longer in days. It was in hours. He stepped out into the rain, the cold air a welcome contrast to the stagnant arrogance of the tower. 24 hours remained until the mirror vault opened, and when it did, the Brennan legacy wouldn't just crumble. It would vanish. The following afternoon, the air inside the mirror vault's control suite was thick with the scent of hot silicon and expensive cologne. Oliver West stood near the back of the room, his presence as unobtrusive as the shadows cast by the towering server racks. He watched as the light from a dozen high-definition monitors bathed the space in a cold, artificial blue. Austin Brennan stood at the center of it all, his tailored charcoal suit fitting him with the kind of precision only inherited money could buy. He was holding court for Marcus and a handful of senior board members who had come for a final progress report. Austin gestured toward the main screen, where a complex lattice of encryption nodes pulsed like a digital heartbeat. "The architecture I've finalized here is impenetrable," he said, his voice ringing with a practiced, hollow authority. He glanced back at the board members, flashing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I spent many late nights refining the core algorithm to ensure that Brennan Tower remains the gold standard of data security. It's a legacy of innovation that I'm proud to lead." Oliver felt a familiar tightening in his chest, but he kept his expression neutral. Beside him, Lucas Rivera shifted his weight, his knuckles turning white as he gripped a tablet. Lucas opened his mouth to speak, but Oliver placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. The time for corrections had passed. "It's an impressive feat, Austin," Marcus said, his voice measured. The legal counsel adjusted his glasses, his gaze flickering from the screen to Oliver, then back again. "Though I recall the initial Garrison specifications being somewhat different in their approach to decentralized nodes." Austin waved a dismissive hand, the gold on his wrist catching the light. "The Garrison concepts were a starting point, certainly, but they lacked the modern finesse I've implemented, old tech for an old era. We've moved beyond that." Oliver stepped forward then, his movements slow and deliberate. The rhythmic hum of the servers seemed to fade into the background as he approached the center of the room. He could feel the weight of the silver drive in his pocket, a cold, hard secret pressed against his thigh. "Finesse is only as good as the foundation it sits on," he said quietly. Austin turned, his smirk faltering for a fraction of a second before hardening into a mask of contempt. "Still here, Oliver. I thought you'd be halfway through packing your desk by now. Don't tell me you're looking for a last-minute participation trophy." "I'm just offering a word of professional caution," he replied, meeting the other man's gaze without blinking. "Systems built on borrowed logic tend to have a way of reverting to their original owners. You should be careful about what you claim as your own. Integrity is a binary, Austin. It's either there or the whole system collapses under its own weight." A few of the board members exchanged uneasy glances. The room had gone quiet, the only sound the faint, high-pitched whine of a cooling fan. Austin let out a sharp, jagged laugh that echoed off the glass walls. "Integrity? You're lecturing me on integrity." He stepped into Oliver's personal space, the smell of his overpriced espresso cloying and heavy. "My foundation is $1 billion and a name that carries weight in every capital on Earth. You're just a ghost in the machine, a footnote in a history book I'm currently writing. Tomorrow night, when the vault opens and the world sees what I've built, nobody is going to remember the man who used to hold the keys." He turned back to the board members, dismissing the warning with a flick of his fingers. "Go home, Oliver. You're starting to sound like a fortune cookie. We have a gala to prepare for, and frankly, you're depressing the guests." Oliver didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply nodded to Marcus, who was watching him with a look of intense, silent curiosity. As he turned to leave, he felt a strange sense of peace. The arrogance in the room was so thick it was blinding, a perfect shroud for the trap he had spent years meticulously setting. He walked out of the control suite and into the hallway, Lucas trailing close behind. They reached the elevator, and as the doors slid shut, Oliver pulled out his phone. The countdown on the screen was glowing red. 18 hours. "He didn't listen," Lucas whispered, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and excitement. "He couldn't," Oliver replied, watching the floor numbers descend. "He spent so long believing his own lies that he's forgotten how to recognize the truth. But the Mirror Vault doesn't care about names or legacies. It only cares about the code." He looked at his reflection in the polished steel of the elevator doors. Tomorrow, the mirrors would turn, and for the first time in his life, Austin Brennan would have to look at exactly what he had become. Oliver stepped out into the cool evening air, the first raindrops of a coming storm splashing against the pavement. The warning had been given. Now, there was only the wait. The evening of the Brennan Global Gala arrived with a heavy, humid heat that seemed to cling to the glass skin of the corporate headquarters. Inside the grand atrium, the air was filtered to a crisp, sterile perfection, smelling faintly of expensive lilies and the ozone of 1,000 high-end electronics. It was a cathedral of ego, built from white marble and polished chrome, designed specifically to make anyone without a 7-figure portfolio feel small. Oliver West stood near the perimeter of the room, his back to a towering sculpture of brushed steel. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo. He had chosen a charcoal suit, tailored but understated, a sharp contrast to the sea of silk lapels and glittering gowns. He felt the weight of the hardware encrypted on the drive in his pocket, a small, cold piece of metal that felt heavier than any mountain. Beside him, Lucas Rivera adjusted his tie for the 10th time, his fingers trembling. "You look like you're waiting for a firing squad," Oliver said softly, his voice a calm anchor in the rising tide of the room's chatter. "I feel like I'm standing on a landmine," Lucas whispered back, his eyes darting toward the center of the atrium. There, beneath a waterfall of crystal light, Austin Brennan was holding court. He looked every bit the crown prince of a dying empire, dressed in a midnight blue velvet dinner jacket that probably cost more than Lucas's annual salary. He was laughing, a loud, jagged sound that cut through the refined hum of the string quartet. In his hand, a crystal flute of vintage champagne caught the light, bubbles rising like the frantic ambitions of the men surrounding him. Austin spotted them, and his smile didn't so much grow as it sharpened. He excused himself from a group of investors and strode over, his gait radiating the casual arrogance of a man who believed the floor rose to meet his feet. "Oliver, I'm surprised the security team didn't mistake you for the catering staff," Austin said, loud enough for a nearby group of board members to turn and look. He didn't offer a hand. Instead, he reached out and flicked a piece of invisible lint off Oliver's shoulder with a sneer. "I suppose even the help wants to see the moment history is made." Oliver didn't flinch. He met the man's gaze with a terrifyingly still expression. "I wouldn't miss this for anything, Austin. It's rare to see a legacy defined in a single night." "Spoken like a man who knows he's about to be forgotten," Austin replied, leaning in closer. The scent of his expensive, woodsy cologne was suffocating. "After tonight, the Mirror Vault won't be your little science project anymore. It'll be the Brennan flagship, and you'll be a footnote in a manual that nobody bothers to read." A few of the surrounding sycophants chuckled. Austin preened, turning his back on Oliver to address William Garrison, one of the primary stakeholders who had just joined the circle. "William, you're just in time. I was just explaining to our former lead engineer that the era of integrity over profit is officially over. Tonight, we show the world what real vision looks like." William Garrison glanced at Oliver, his expression unreadable, then back to the younger Brennan. "The board is expecting a flawless demonstration, Austin. The rumors of the system's volatility have made some people nervous." Austin waved a dismissive hand, the champagne in his glass sloshing dangerously close to the rim. "Nervous, please. The system is perfect because I've spent the last 48 hours refining the final protocols myself. Oliver here was a bit too precious with the safety buffers. I've streamlined them. The Mirror Vault is faster, leaner, and ready to dominate." Oliver felt a surge of cold satisfaction. "You changed the buffers." "I optimized them," Austin corrected, his voice dripping with condescension. "Something you were too timid to do. You always did lack the killer instinct, Oliver. That's why you're standing over here with the coat racks while I'm about to take the stage." He turned to a passing server, grabbed a fresh glass of bourbon, and handed his empty champagne flute to Lucas as if the junior engineer were a busboy. "Keep yourself busy, kid. Try not to spill anything on the marble." As Austin walked away to join his father, Charles Brennan, near the podium, Lucas looked down at the empty glass in his hand, his face burning with a mixture of shame and fury. "He's going to kill the system," Lucas hissed. "If he messed with the safety buffers, the feedback loop will." "I know," Oliver interrupted, his voice like a sheet of ice. He checked his watch. The countdown was at 20 minutes. "He thinks he's removing the brakes from a car. He doesn't realize he's pulling the pins out of the grenades holding the engine together." Across the room, Charles Brennan stood at the podium, tapping the microphone. The room began to settle, the high society chatter dying down into an expectant silence. The lights in the atrium dimmed, leaving the crowd in a soft, blue-hued twilight. On the massive screen behind the podium, the Brennan Global logo pulsed with a rhythmic, digital heartbeat. Oliver watched Austin take his place on the stage, standing tall and chest out, looking for all the world like a conqueror. The arrogance radiating from him was almost physical, a palpable force that seemed to fill the room. He caught Oliver's eye from across the distance and winked, a final, mocking gesture of victory. Oliver reached into his pocket and gripped the drive. He wasn't looking at Austin anymore. He was looking at the mirror vault's primary interface terminal, glowing a soft, deceptive green in the shadows of the stage. The air in the room felt charged, the static electricity of a coming storm prickling at the skin. Oliver could hear the hum of the servers beneath the floorboards, a low-frequency vibration that resonated in his bones. It was the sound of a countdown reaching its end. Charles Brennan began to speak, his voice booming through the speakers, full of pride and the false promise of a new era. He spoke of his son's brilliance, of the tireless nights Austin had supposedly spent perfecting the code, and of the absolute security the mirror vault would provide to the world's most elite data. Oliver took a slow, deep breath, the scent of the lilies now replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of the cooling system working at maximum capacity. He looked at Lucas, who was now standing perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the stage. "It's time," Oliver whispered. As Charles Brennan gestured for his son to step forward and activate the system, the digital clock on Oliver's phone hit 0. The screen on the stage flickered once, a jagged line of red cutting through the Brennan blue. Austin reached for the holographic interface, his fingers poised to claim a glory that didn't belong to him, unaware that the mirrors were already beginning to turn. The digital red bleed on the screen wasn't a glitch. It was a signature. Austin Brennan stood frozen, his hand still poised over the console as the mirror vault branding dissolved into a series of stark, white lines of text. The audience of 500 elite investors and tech journalists fell into a silence so absolute that the hum of the cooling system sounded like a roar. Oliver West stepped from the periphery of the stage into the spotlight. He didn't rush. He walked with the measured gait of a man who had already won. His eyes weren't on the crowd, but on the man who had spent months claiming his labor as his own. "The system isn't crashing, Austin," Oliver said, his voice amplified by the lapel mic he'd never turned off. "It's just performing a scheduled audit, one you neglected to mention in the white papers." Austin's face underwent a violent transformation. The smug, sun-kissed glow he'd worn all evening curdled into a sickly, translucent gray. His jaw didn't just drop. It hung slack, his bottom lip trembling as his eyes darted frantically across the lines of code scrolling over his reflection. The veins in his neck cordoned into thick ropes, and a sheen of cold sweat broke across his forehead, matting his perfectly styled hair. He looked less like a tech visionary, and more like a cornered animal, realizing the trap wasn't just closed, it was shrinking. His breath came in ragged, audible hitches that the microphones caught and broadcasted to the entire room, stripping away the last of his carefully curated composure. Charles Brennan surged toward the edge of the stage, his face a mask of purple-hued fury and dawning realization. He looked from the screen, which now displayed the original encryption keys with timestamps dating back 3 years, to his son. Beside him, William Garrison leaned forward, his silver eyebrows knitting together in a scowl of pure professional disgust. Marcus, the legal counsel, didn't move a muscle. He simply adjusted his spectacles, his gaze fixed on the screen where the theft was being mapped out in real time. Lucas Rivera stood near the server racks, arms crossed, a small, grim smile playing on his lips as he watched the empire of lies tilt on its axis. "This is a lie," Austin finally shrieked, his voice cracking. He lunged for the console, his fingers slapping uselessly at the holographic interface. "He hacked it. He's sabotaging the launch." "I didn't have to hack it," Oliver replied, his tone as cold as the server room. "I wrote it, every line, every backdoor, including the one that triggers when someone tries to overwrite the creator's digital signature with a fraudulent one." He pulled a small, obsidian-black drive from his pocket and held it up. The light caught its polished surface. The screen behind him shifted one last time, displaying a side-by-side comparison of the original Brennan designs and the actual architecture. The overlap was 100%, right down to the deliberate, non-functional code comments Oliver had buried like landmines months ago. The room erupted, not in applause, but in the sharp, ugly sound of 100 private conversations turning toxic. Investors were already on their phones, their voices low and urgent. The social currency Austin had traded on for years was evaporating in the heat of the stage lights. Oliver walked toward the edge of the stage, passing the younger man without a second glance. He stopped just long enough to look Charles in the eye. The CEO looked aged, his shoulders slumped as he watched his legacy dissolve. "You said I was a necessary expense that could be replaced," Oliver said, loud enough for the front row to hear. "But you forgot one thing about architects, Charles. We know exactly which brick holds up the entire house." He turned back to Austin, who was now slumped against the console, his eyes glassy and vacant as he stared at the red, "Access Denied" message flashing over his name. "You didn't build a vault, Austin," Oliver said, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a blade. "You built a mirror, and it's finally showing everyone exactly who you are." Oliver didn't wait for a rebuttal. He didn't stay to watch the security guards move in or to hear the frantic excuses. Charles was beginning to stammer to William Garrison. He simply stepped off the stage and walked toward the exit. Lucas was already there, holding the door open. As they stepped out into the cool night air, the heavy mahogany doors muffled the sounds of the Brennan family's world falling apart. The night air was sharp, smelling of impending rain, and the heavy exhaust of idling town cars. Oliver West stood on the sidewalk just past the heavy mahogany doors, his breath hitching slightly as the adrenaline began its slow, icy retreat. Beside him, Lucas was vibrating with a silent, manic energy, his eyes wide as he looked back at the building they had just dismantled from the inside out. The silence didn't last. The doors burst open again, the muffled roar of the frantic crowd inside spilling out onto the pavement. Austin Brennan stumbled out first, his designer tuxedo jacket unbuttoned and flapping like the wings of a grounded bird. He looked less like a CEO in waiting and more like a man who had just seen a ghost. His skin, usually a pampered, sun-kissed tan, had turned a sickly shade of gray-green, appearing translucent under the harsh lead streetlights. Sweat beaded along his hairline, and his lower lip trembled with a rhythmic, uncontrollable twitch that made his mouth look lopsided. "You think you're clever." Austin's voice was a jagged wreck, stripped of its usual oily confidence. He lunged toward the sidewalk, but stopped short when he saw William Garrison and Charles Brennan following him out. "Dad, it was a hack. He planted that code. Oliver sabotaged the presentation because he knew he couldn't match my design. It's digital terrorism." He turned his frantic gaze toward Garrison, his hands gesturing wildly. "William, you can't listen to a disgruntled ex-employee. The vault is secure. The error message was a fluke, a localized glitch. My team will have it patched by morning." William Garrison didn't move. He stood with his arms crossed over his tailored wool coat, his expression as unyielding as the granite facade of the building behind him. He didn't look at the young man. He looked at Charles. "The glitch wasn't in the code, Austin," Garrison said, his voice a low rumble that cut through the younger man's screeching. "The glitch is in the bloodline." Charles Brennan looked as though he had aged a decade in the last 10 minutes. He stared at his son, his eyes hollow. "Stop talking, Austin. Every word you say is another nail in the coffin of this firm." "I'm not stopping," Austin yelled, his voice cracking. He turned back to Oliver, his eyes bloodshot and darting. "You're a thief. You stole the credit for my vision, and now you're trying to burn the whole house down because you're jealous of what I was born into. You're nothing but a glorified calculator in a cheap suit." Oliver didn't flinch. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a single, slim flash drive. He didn't hand it to Austin. He handed it to Marcus, the legal counsel who had been standing quietly in the shadows of the portico. "That's the original time-stamped architecture for the Brennan Vault," Oliver said, his voice steady as a heartbeat. "Along with the internal memos where Austin explicitly ordered the removal of the secondary failsafes to save on aesthetic costs. Marcus has had the encrypted copy for 48 hours. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the city seemed to hold its breath. Austin's face underwent a terrifying transformation. The frantic energy vanished, replaced by a hollow, slack-jawed vacuum. His eyes went wide, the pupils shrinking to pinpricks as the reality of the legal implications hit him. His jaw dropped, but no sound came out. His throat worked in silent, convulsive gulps like a fish pulled from water. The arrogance that had been his armor for years didn't just crack, it evaporated, leaving behind a small, terrified boy who realized the floor had finally vanished beneath his feet. Marcus took the drive with a grim nod. "I've already reviewed the preliminary files, Charles. If this matches the server logs, we aren't just looking at a failed presentation. We're looking at criminal negligence and shareholder fraud." "Dad," Austin whispered, the words small and pathetic. Charles didn't look at him. He turned to Garrison. "William, Don't," Garrison interrupted, stepping toward the curb where his driver was already opening the door. "My legal team will be at your office at 8 a.m. to discuss the termination of our contract and the recovery of the advance. I suggest you find a very good lawyer for your son. He's going to need one." Garrison paused, his gaze shifting to Oliver. He gave a single, respectful nod, a silent acknowledgement of a professional who had finally claimed his due. Then the heavy door of the limousine closed, and the car pulled away, leaving the Brennans standing in the wake of its exhaust. Lucas let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since the previous chapter of their lives began. He looked at Oliver, a grin slowly spreading across his face. "I think that's our cue." Austin was on his knees now, fumbling with his phone, his fingers shaking so violently he dropped the device onto the damp concrete. The screen shattered, a spider web of cracks mirroring the state of his future. He looked up at Oliver, his expression a mask of pure, impotent rage. "You destroyed everything," he hissed, the venom returning now that he was cornered. "I'll make sure you never work in this industry again. I'll spend every cent I have to bury you." Oliver stepped closer, looking down at the man who had spent months trying to erase his existence. He felt no anger, only a profound sense of clarity. "You don't have any sense left, Austin," Oliver said, the words falling like stones into a well. "The board is meeting in an hour to freeze your assets and remove your father as CEO. You didn't build a vault. You built a prison, and the door's just locked from the outside." Oliver turned his back on the kneeling man, the sound of Austin's frantic, sobbing excuses fading as he walked toward the corner. He didn't look back to see Charles Brennan cover his face with his hands, or to see the security guards moving in to escort the former golden boy off the property. He reached the end of the block and stopped, looking at the city lights reflecting in the puddles. He felt lighter than he had in years. The weight of the Brennan name was gone, replaced by the solid, undeniable weight of his own reputation. "Where to now?" Lucas asked, falling into step beside him. Oliver checked his watch. The night was far from over, and the morning would bring a new set of challenges, but for the first time, he was the one holding the keys. "Now," Oliver said, "we go to work." The fallout from the board meeting was a surgical strike that left the Brennan legacy in ruins. Within 72 hours, the board of directors had officially stripped Charles Brennan of his chairmanship, citing gross negligence and ethical violations that could no longer be swept under the rug. Marcus, the legal counsel, ensured that the evidence of Austin's fraud was turned over to federal investigators, turning the once mighty firm into a crime scene of forensic accounting and shattered reputations. Lucas Rivera and the core engineering team resigned en masse the following morning, following their leader out the door before the first subpoenas could even be served. The Brennans tried to fight, but with William Garrison leading the investor revolt, their assets were frozen faster than they could hire a defense team. By the time the dust settled, the Brennan name was no longer a symbol of power, but a cautionary tale whispered in the halls of every major firm in the city. 8 months later, the glass and steel of the city felt different under the morning sun. Oliver West stood in the center of the penthouse suite that now served as the headquarters for West Engineering. The air here was different, clean, smelling of fresh rain, and the expensive, dark roast espresso humming in the corner. He watched through the floor-to-ceiling windows as the city began its morning crawl. He wasn't looking for his name on the buildings anymore. He knew it was written into the very blueprints of the infrastructure keeping the city alive. "The bridge project in the North District just passed inspection," Lucas said, stepping into the office with a tablet in hand. He looked different now, too. The frantic energy of a junior engineer had been replaced by the steady confidence of a partner. "The city council wants to know if you're available for the ribbon-cutting ceremony next month." Oliver turned, his thumb tracing the smooth, cool edge of his titanium watch. "Tell them I'll be there, but no VIP tents. I want to be on the ground with the crew." "Already handled," his friend replied with a grin. "I knew you'd say that." Later that afternoon, Oliver found himself standing on a damp sidewalk outside the municipal courthouse. He had just finished a meeting with the city's planning commission, and the heavy, humid air tasted of salt and exhaust. He was waiting for his driver when he saw a figure huddled on a bench near the bus stop. The man was wearing a designer wool coat that had once been the height of fashion, but it was now frayed at the cuffs and stained with something dark near the hem. Austin Brennan sat with his shoulders hunched, his hands buried deep in his pockets. He looked smaller than Oliver remembered. The arrogance that had once acted as a physical shield had evaporated, leaving behind a man who looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. As Oliver approached, Austin looked up. The transformation was jarring. His face was gaunt, the skin sallow and hanging loose around a jawline that used to be held with such entitlement. His eyes, once bright with the fire of unearned superiority, were now dull and bloodshot. When he recognized Oliver, his entire body flinched, a visible tremor running through his frame. His mouth opened, perhaps to hurl one last insult or to beg for a mercy he had never shown, but no sound came out. He simply stared, his lower lip trembling as he realized that the man he had once called a glorified mechanic was now the one the entire city looked to for leadership. Oliver didn't stop. He didn't gloat, and he didn't offer a hand. He simply met the man's gaze for 3 long, silent seconds. In that look, he saw the total collapse of a legacy, the realization in Austin's eyes that the world hadn't ended when he lost his money. It had simply moved on without him. The bus hissed to a stop, belching a cloud of black smoke that briefly obscured the disgraced air. When the air cleared, the bench was empty, and the bus was pulling away into the gray afternoon. "Everything okay, Oliver?" Lucas asked, pulling up to the curb in the company's sleek, understated sedan. Oliver climbed into the back seat, the scent of high-end leather and silence wrapping around him. "Everything is exactly as it should be," he said, though his voice held a trace of something heavy. He looked at his hands. They were clean, free of the grease and grime of the old shops, but they felt different. He had won. He had dismantled the people who tried to bury him and built a kingdom on the ruins of their ego. But as he watched the city blur past the window, he realized the cost. He wasn't the sleeping lion anymore. He was the man who knew exactly how much pressure it took to make a person break. He had found his justice, but in the process, he had traded his quiet peace for a cold, immovable strength. He leaned back, closing his eyes as the car sped toward the next project. The Brennan era was over, and the era of West had begun, built not on blood or inheritance, but on the undeniable weight of the truth.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.